I believe that we have to go to a non-negotiated price, totally online, transparent, 100% pickup and delivery model. But we also have to have the ability to do remote in most cases, in some cases like commercial customers, physical service of the vehicle.
Over the last year, there's been a lot of speculation surrounding the future of dealerships. You see, for decades, car manufacturers have been required to sell cars through a franchise dealership model. This began in the early 1900s and has continued in large part due to FTC regulation and the beast that is the franchise industry. Basically, the franchise dealership model is an antiquated business, but because of government regulation and lobbyists in DC, this business has remained intact and relatively unchanged, despite the fact that it's expensive, inefficient, and is a wildly hated process across the board. But then, of course, Tesla entered the picture, shook everything up with their direct-to-consumer model, and here we are today. And as a result, currently in present day, many major manufacturers, including Mercedes, Volvo, Ford, GM, BMW, and more, have either already announced plans to implement a direct-to-consumer model, or they've already begun executing on those plans. But when it comes to vehicle manufacturers and their relationship with the dealership and the direct-to-consumer model that they're wanting to implement, the water can get really muddy, and manufacturers must tread lightly. Because how do manufacturers implement a direct-to-consumer model when there's already thousands of dealerships across the entire country? And in many cases, manufacturers are doing this through their new electric vehicle lineup. And Ford is one of the first major players to actually begin executing this plan. And it's going to give us some really great insight into how dealerships will end up working and functioning moving forward. And of course, their role in the sales process as well. In a statement by Ford CEO Jim Farley last week, he stated that 65% of U.S. dealers have agreed to sell electric vehicles under the company's new electric vehicle investment program. Ford has about 3,000 franchise dealerships in the United States, and of those, 1,920 have opted into investing into this program. You see, Ford is splitting into two different units. Both of them will be separate businesses under the Ford name. Ford Blue, which will focus on traditional gas-powered vehicles, as well as the Ford Model E program, which will focus on their new electric vehicle lineup. And this is the program that many people are watching and keeping an eye on. Dealerships by default are already operating under the Ford Blue business model, but the Ford Model E program is a new program that dealerships have the ability to opt into or opt out of. And for those dealerships that did opt into the Ford Model E program, it required a heavy investment into electric vehicle infrastructure, and it ranged from $500,000 to $1.2 million. And this investment would dictate and cover things like charging infrastructure being installed at dealerships, specific training to take place with dealership staff, and it would also dictate how dealerships could sell electric vehicles in the future, as well as how many allocations they were received, and even how electric vehicles could be serviced at their facility. If a dealership opted out of this program, which 35% of them did, it means that these dealerships do not have the ability to sell new Ford electric vehicles, and it also means that these dealerships cannot opt back into the program until 2027, which is when the program reopens. This is one of the first few glances that we've seen into how dealerships and manufacturers are going to handle this new electric vehicle direct-to-consumer model moving forward, and I think it's interesting to see how these different companies are approaching it. For example, GM is doing something similar to Ford, but they're not making the new dealer program and investment program optional. In fact, it is required. And dealerships that do not want to opt in have to take part in a buyback program on the part of GM.
Well, we've been working with our dealers for the last several years and recognizing the customers changing. And we looked and said, let's work together to figure out not only how to meet the customer where they're at, whether they want to buy the vehicle completely online or whether they literally want to go to the dealer and kick the tires. And so we've developed the systems. But then we also started to work with the dealers and say, how do we make the cost of selling a vehicle less expensive?
Ford is testing the water right now, but if things are successful, there's almost no doubt that they will eventually force all of their dealerships to make the plunge into the EV space. And in many ways, this kind of kills two birds with one stone, because not only do you implement a new and profitable business model, but you also force dealerships to make a decision, and in some cases, they can even thin out some of their low-performing dealers, because low-performing dealerships probably won't opt in to spending $500,000 to $1.2 million. Now, the one piece of bad news that comes along with this new Ford program that has been released and announced in the last few weeks is the fact that this sort of solidifies the fact that dealerships are not going anywhere, which I know is something many of us were hoping for, even if it was wishful thinking. I said in a video earlier this year that I don't think that dealerships are going to go away entirely. Instead, I think their role in the sales process is going to drastically change. And instead of dealerships being a place that you go to in order to buy a car, which is how things currently are, dealerships may be instead a place where you go in order to educate yourself on a car purchase, or where you go solely to service your vehicle. And I think that these changes coming to Ford really strengthen that prediction. Ford CEO Jim Farley said in a statement last week that switching to a direct consumer model will reduce selling and distribution costs by $2,000 per vehicle. And many manufacturers, not just Ford, are really leaning into the data that suggests that buying a car direct to consumer rather than through a salesman and through a dealership is just cheaper. Not to mention more enjoyable, more streamlined, and more efficient.
So what we're doing with the dealers, which is not easy, is we're stress testing each other's ideas around standards. Once we put in those standards, we can go to this leaner model for purchase and still have a physical follow-up where things, go wrong when they do, which they will, they're cars.
And according to not only Ford, but a wide variety of different sources, the role of the dealership moving forward could be in the form of a tool in the selling process rather than the seller itself. And this could in turn mean that for the dealership, there will be smaller sales staff, larger service departments, a smaller footprint, not only in building size, but also lot size as well, and possibly an entirely new different payment structure, where rather than spending your time talking to and being educated by somebody whose livelihood depends on whether or not you buy that car, you could instead talk to an educated, relatively unbiased person who's making hourly or salary wages. And thus, there's much less pressure when it comes to actually buying the car, and it results in a much more enjoyable experience. And then there is, of course, the other alternative, which is something I've talked about on my channel multiple times, where dealerships essentially become delivery centers and service centers rather than sales centers. The truth is, we don't know, but I do think that Ford and GM are the players to watch whenever we look at this transition that manufacturers are making with their relationship to dealerships. And though I think it's very, very unlikely that we're going to see the death of the dealership anytime soon, I do think that we will see a large pivot in the role of the dealership moving forward. And what we're seeing right now with Ford and GM is a glimpse to how this may look. And though I do hope long-term this improves the buying experience for any car buyer out there, I think it's safe to say that it's going to be a pretty long time before we notice any significant changes on a consumer level. But like always, you guys, if you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. And I'll see you guys in the next video.